Hello, and welcome to this first podcast on the Magnus Arvid Substack. I am Magnus Arvid, also known as Magnus in Danish, in case any of you were curious. Today I'm basically going to give you a pretty casual presentation of the lecture I gave at the Egyptological-Assyriological Conference in Copenhagen this year, in early May. It's a lecture about my master's thesis, which I completed last year. So, without further ado, let's get into it. Where are we? Well, we're in the Middle East. It's also sometimes called the Near East. Sometimes it's called West Asia. There's a lot of things you could call this area of the world. I don't have any strong preferences, so that's all I have to say about that. We're in the first millennium BCE. Specifically, you can see here that I said the 8th to the 1st centuries. The parameters that I used originally were the ascent of Sargon II to the throne of Assyria in 722 BCE, and then the latest dates for the Dead Sea Scrolls and their provenance, the Qumran texts as they're also called. They have just been pushed most likely a little bit further back, at least some of the texts have. There's an interesting new AI study came out, or it's a study that uses some AI methods to date some of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it has pushed some of them back like 50 to 100 years. That's very interesting. I haven't looked into it, but this is very recently published research and sounds quite interesting. It's causing a little bit of a stir in the religious scholarship circles that deal with this part of the world. So very cool. Anyways, moving on. I'll be talking to you today about Babylonia, Assyria, and the Levant mainly. And really what I want you to take away from this presentation more than anything is that you can draw a lot of borders in this region, and you can talk about a lot of different languages and different cultures, different religions. But this area tends, even including the wider Mediterranean, I would say, and you can go even further than that. But this area, what I really want you to take away is that this area is its own little microcosm of meandering ideas and myths and stories, ways to think about the world and talk about the world, write about the world. And I hope that will become apparent as we go on here. Of course, if you've read my thesis already, you're not going to learn anything new here. This is just a very condensed presentation of that thesis, so keep that in mind. Also keep in mind, I have some training in anthropology, I have training in Assyriology, and I have training in biblical studies. So this is a kind of a interdisciplinary study in a lot of ways, which you'll probably also notice as we go on. And important disclaimer, obviously, I'm not here to try and claim the originality or divinity of one script or one religion over any other ones. I don't care about that. I'm not here to make religious arguments. I am here because I'm interested in how knowledge moves around and how people use knowledge and ideas. When I say knowledge, that means literally, it can mean anything. So the fact that Marduk is the chief god in the later Babylonian pantheon and that his son is Nabu, that I qualify that as a kind of knowledge, even though by modern standards most of us would probably say, well, it's not really true though, is it? Or you can discuss a lot about the quote unquote existence of gods and yada yada, but just know that when I say knowledge, I'm talking about anything that the people of Babylonia and Assyria or the Levant may have known, Okay, I hope that makes sense. Moving on, just to clear up some terms here, when I talk about biblical scholarship, that means a lot of things. Biblical scholarship is a quite wide umbrella in my study here. So it refers to essentially any academic discipline that has to do with the Hebrew Bible or the Gospels. So anything from Jewish studies to ecclesiastical history or biblical archaeology, and so on and so forth. These really all go under this umbrella for my purposes. And then real quick, Assyriology. A little bit of a confusing term there, because most people who have a degree in Assyriology do not just have a degree in Assyrian history and language and culture. Most people with an Assyriology degree, they will have learned to read the cuneiform script, which you see in front of you right now. It is a script, but it has many different sort of variations. It existed for several thousand years, and it developed a lot over time. Anyways, Assyriology is both the study of this cuneiform script, and it's the study of the Akkadian language, which includes Babylonian and Assyrian. These are dialects of Akkadian, and the Sumerian language. Some Assyriologists also study Hittite or Hurrian. There are a lot of languages that do not necessarily use cuneiform all the time. Hittite does mostly, but then there's something like Luwian hieroglyphs and stuff like this. So Assyriology is a pretty broad thing when you really get into it. It's more correct, I think, to say that it's just the study of ancient Near Eastern history and cuneiform literature and occasionally other literature as well. So there we go. Now, this thesis was mainly founded on sort of comparing two pairs of literary sources. The first pair being the probably most well-known parallel between Mesopotamian and biblical mythology, and that is the story of Noah in Genesis 5:9, and the study of Atrahasis or Utnapishtim in the standard version of the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, there are standalone versions of the Atrahasis or Utnapishtim story, but for reasons I will get back into later, I chose specifically to work with the Gilgamesh story that incorporates this Atrahasis narrative. But I'll get back to that. The second pair of stories is a much more obscure parallel between biblical and Mesopotamian myth. Simply not as well known an example, not as much research has been done on it. In fact, the last sort of, before I published my thesis, there was someone called, there's an Assyriologist, John Westenholz, who published a book in, I believe, the mid-90s. And she references Brian Lewis, who is the last guys who really do in-depth research on the Sargon legend that sort of is the one half of this pair of texts. And that PhD is from 1980. So yeah, this is a pretty obscure pair by comparison. The Sargon legend especially is a really obscure text. We only have 3 or 4 of them in existence, and they're all heavily fragmented. So essentially we don't know the second half of this story because it's way too fragmented to understand it. But I'll get back into the details of this later on. Just suffice it to say, this is a very obscure pair compared to the first one. Yet it still has a stunning amount of similarities. So yeah, we'll get back into it in a second, but those are the primary sources. They make sort of they form the basis of this study. Now, in order to just get everyone on the same page here, I'm just going to recount really quickly, briefly, these stories. If you want a more in-depth sort of recounting of them, I just recommend you go and read them yourselves. All these stories can be found, with exception of the Sargon legend, relatively easily. The Sargon legend is a bit harder to come across, but hey, yeah, you can just look at my thesis on the Substack. You can find the sources there. They're great. Here we go. Anyways, right, so let me recount these stories for you real quick here. Noah, of course, is a guy who lived on the earth before the Great Flood, but then due to the wickedness of man, whatever that specifically entails, God decides to flood the earth, restart the project, but he warns this guy Noah, because he's pretty cool, and tells him, hey, Noah, you should bring your family and a bunch of animals on this boat and sail around while the world is flooded. Now, if you read the Hebrew Bible, there are some specifics as to whether, like, if the animal is clean or not, how many pairs are you then supposed to bring of it, and so on and so forth. But I'm not going to go into detail with that here. Suffice it to say, there are more details and more circumstantiality going on with this whole building project and so on than I have time or will to explain here. So let's just let's leave it at that. The world floods. It sails around for 40 days and 40 nights, sees mountain peaks jutting out of the water in this great world ocean, and decides to send out 3 birds in order to find land. And so he sends out first a crow or raven, and that one doesn't find land. He sends out 1 pigeon or dove. That one also doesn't find land. He sends out another one, and that one finds land. So, great. He then sets up a little sacrifice for God, and it's like, God kind of realizes maybe that was a little bit of an overkill I'm not going to do something that drastic again if I get annoyed with people. And he sets a great rainbow in the sky to symbolize this new friendship with man. Wonderful. Then we have the story of Utnapishtim, or Atrahasis, depending on his name. If you read the standard version of Gilgamesh, he's literally called both those names at different times during the story. So, I'm just going to call him Utnapishtim from now on, but it's apparently even the texts themselves, they aren't in any agreement on whether he is Atrahasis, Utnapishtim, or both. So, yeah, whatever. But as I said earlier, there are standalone versions of this story that exist outside of the Gilgamesh narrative. I chose deliberately to not really focus on those here. Here I focus more on it in the context of the Gilgamesh narrative, because it kind of gets its own meaning. It gives its own meaning to the Gilgamesh narrative, which is pretty interesting. But I'll get back to that. Suffice it to say, Utnapishtim, he was a guy who lived in the ancient city of Shuruppak, which is this Mesopotamian ancient city, which was considered antediluvian by Mesopotamians, ancient Mesopotamians, at least the scholars. And so apparently the gods dwelt in this city at the time, and Enlil was sort of the leader of the pantheon when this story is recorded, it seems like. Or at least there's a memory of him, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter at all. He lives in the city, and the gods decide that they're going to flood the world because they're tired of people being noisy, which the specific word has been discussed a lot, and is still being discussed. It's the same as the wickedness of man. There's a lot of... There's not really... It's not very specific what the issue is, but there's some kind of problem, and the gods are tired of it, so they decide to flood the earth. This is kind of Enlil. He's kind of the mastermind of this plan here, and the god of wisdom and fresh water, Ea, he decides, or rather he kind of takes pity on specifically Utnapishtim. He thinks it's kind of a shame because that guy's pretty cool, and so he decides to warn Utnapishtim of the impending flood, tells him to not only build a huge boat and bring 2 of each animal on the boat as well as his family, but also to bring precious metals and skilled craftsmen who can work those metals. So it's a little bit more of a detailed shopping list than Noah had. But in any case, the flood comes. He sails around for 7 days and 7 nights. A little bit shorter than Noah. And then he sends out, after seeing mountain peaks jutting out of the water, he sends out 3 birds in order to find land. First a pigeon or dove, which doesn't find land. Then a swallow, which also doesn't find land. And then a crow or raven, which does find land. For some reason, the corvids and the pigeons have been switched around in these 2 narratives. I don't know why, if there's a preference for one or the other. But that's just one of the many kind of throw your hands to the sides, like I have no idea kind of situations we're dealing with here. Great. Anyways, he finds lands. He set up a sacrifice for the gods, and the gods come down and swarm the sacrifice like flies. It's one in some versions of the story they're described. Quite desperate, it seems. And then they also kind of bicker. There's this goddess called here simply the mother goddess, Belit Ili. Essentially translates to the mother of gods. She's really angry with Enlil for having orchestrated this whole flood business, and she promises nothing like this is going to happen again. And she has this necklace with beads that look like flies, which she says will now symbolize all of the fallen humans who died in the flood, and remind everyone, that is the gods, to not do such drastic things to control the population anymore. Now these stories are obviously quite similar in a lot of ways. I didn't give you the full stories. If you should obviously yourself, if you're interested, look further into this and read the full stories and familiarize yourself with them. There are many differences in the stories as well, and these are long narratives that might have had sort of different points for existing. We don't really know all of these things. But suffice it to say, it's still quite interesting that there are these similarities that there are. So, before we move on here, I just want to show you a fun little picture. This is Some of you might be familiar with Irving Finkel. He's a curator at the British Museum and professor of Assyriology as well. Emeritus, I think, at this point. But he's a pretty cool guy, pretty fun guy. He has and I think it still isn't published, he has a tablet. He has some tablet, and I think it's an Atrahasis standalone story. And in that particular version, usually in these stories, Ea, the god of wisdom and freshwater, he does give some sort of concrete instruction to how to build the boat and sort of so on and so forth. But in the story that Finkel works with here, that one has so much detail about how to build a boat that he thought, this seems like it's an actual manual for building one. And so he decided in 2015 to go to Iraq and try and assemble this boat. By the way, from in scaled down proportions. So this is a smaller version of what you were told to build in this Atrahasis story. Pretty crazy, but according to Finkel, he was able to build this boat from the instructions in the text, the boat that you get instructions to build in this story. Kind of crazy. It's like reading the Christmas nativity and then getting a really detailed sort of recipe for your entire Christmas lunch. I don't know. It's a wild thing. Very funny. But that's how that worked. Now notice the picture I got, or the article rather, that I got this picture of Finkel's version of this boat from. Notice that it is called The Ark Before Noah, and it's, the title of the article itself is this the real Noah's Ark? This kind of hints at a lot of the issues with earlier research that's been done into biblical and Mesopotamian parallels. Then I'll get back into that, but this is quite funny. Take it as a little sort of foreshadowing. Now, let's talk about Sargon and Moses. I will try and speed this up a little bit more, but let's start with Sargon. Sargon, he was a man seemingly born in the city of Azubiranu. By the way, sometimes when I say Akkadian words like the city of Azubiranu, I have distinctly the German flair in my pronunciation. This is simply because I learned Akkadian from a German professor, Nicole Brisch. It's a great professor, and very much enjoyed my time studying under her. But due to her lovely pronunciation, I also, for some reason, just took some German pronunciation of Akkadian with me. So that's, I still do it for whatever reason. I mean, I can speak Arabic, but I still sound like I'm a German when I talk about Akkadian language. It's kind of funny, but who cares? Let's move on. So, Sargon, he was born in the city of Azubiranu, which was supposedly, allegedly, on the Euphrates River. And here, well, he was born to a high priestess, and this unnamed high priestess, she decided to abandon him. Now, we're not really told in the text why. There's no reason for it, but several modern historians have suggested it may have been the case that high priestesses were not really supposed to have kids, and that so that's kind of the subtext going on here. That would also, his father, Sargon's father in this story is also just unknown, born to an unknown father. An unnamed high priestess and an unknown father. So that might be the subtext, but we don't know. We were not actually told directly at any point. So all we know is there's a high priestess who gives birth to Sargon, and then she puts him in a pitched reed baskets and sends him down the Euphrates River, where he's eventually found by a gardener named Aki. And Aki seemingly takes him in to raise him, and he may have been a gardener in some sort of palace environment. In whatever case, Sargon grows up to become a great king, and the text then lists a few of his great deeds before essentially the last for the fully eligible part of the fully legible parts of this story has Sargon challenge any future king to replicate what he has done. And that's the whole story. After that, well, that's not the whole story, but after that, it breaks up the versions. Like I said before, we have 3 or 4 exemplaries of this text, and the latter half of it is still to this day mostly incomprehensible. It seems like it gets very philosophical and starts asking a lot of kind of rhetorical questions. But we have no idea still. Hopefully we'll find another version one day that's a bit more intact, but so far we have no clue. Right, in any case, that was Sargon. A little side note here, the picture you see is from a statue that is, as I've written in the text, probably not Sargon, but this statue face here is always used to illustrate him, and we don't know who it is specifically, though. Some people think it might have been Naram-Sin, the probably grandson of Sargon. I'm not going to get into it, though, but that's the statue is probably not Sargon, suffice it to say, but he's always used to signify Sargon for some reason. Right, anyways, let's move on to Moses. Now, I will just tell you the story, and then we'll go from there. So, Moses is born to unknown parents of the house of Levi. The house of Levi in ancient Judaism is, and in Judaism I guess still, is a very important house specifically for sort of prophecy and revelation kinds of contexts. And, well, Moses is abandoned by his unknown parents, who are still, they're still Levites, and he's set in a pitched reed basket on the river Nile, where he floats down until he is found he's spotted by the Pharaoh's daughter, and the Pharaoh's daughter has her maid pick up Moses from the river, and she adopts him. He grows up in a sort of pharaonic palace environment, and of course eventually he grows up to become the guy who leads his people out of slavery in Egypt and to find the promised land, and obviously he also becomes one of the most important prophetic characters in all of Judaism, and Christianity and Islam for that matter. In rabbinic Judaism, he has the credit for having written all of the. He kind of does in Christianity and Islam as well in some cases, for having actually written the Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, and that's why they're also sometimes called the 5 books of Moses. Yeah, that's a whole other story. But in any case, he obviously becomes one of the most important figures in all of 3 great religions. So there we go. So that's Moses. Now, where does that leave us? Well, the question that I want to ask now is, why are these texts so similar? But before we can start talking about why these texts are so similar, I think a little bit of background history on the, research history of these biblical Mesopotamian parallels is in order. I'm gonna just give you a very, very, very short and general rundown here, but I highly recommend you to look into these things yourself. The Babel-Bibel controversy specifically. It's a dark little period of history for a lot of reasons. But let's just get into it. I unfortunately don't have time to give a whole lecture on it here, but I might want to do that at some point. We'll see what happens. But suffice it to say, this is quite important to understand. So, what is the Babel-Bibel controversy? Well, to really shortly sum it up, on your left here, you have a guy called Friedrich Delitzsch. He was a sort of Semiologist professor from Leipzig, who held a lecture series in the early 1900s, which asks some questions about the parallels between the sort of Mesopotamian and biblical mythologies that had just started sort of coming into public view. The similarities between the flood stories of Genesis and Gilgamesh, those had been discovered in the sort of mid-late 1800s, and this was a point in time where research into ancient history and archaeology as well, these fields were very young, and they were still, to be honest, not very well developed. Methodologies were kind of bad. Archaeology tended to destroy a lot of the sites where it worked to a pretty high degree, and it took a long time to sort of develop refined methods for doing archaeology and for understanding the things that we got off the ground. Both archaeologists, who mainly have to interpret things that do not have writing on them, like pots and tools, buildings, art, where historians, Assyriologists in this case, with cuneiform texts, obviously they were the ones working with the cuneiform texts that were coming out of the ground. So Cuneiform was still being deciphered. Akkadian and Sumerian were still being deciphered at this point in time. They were not fully understood languages yet, and it would take still a good while before they would be. To some degree, they still aren't, but that's another story. In any case, this was like the Wild West days of archaeology and Assyriology and Egyptology, for that matter. It was also a time when these things were very much in the public eye. The reading public of Europe were really keen on, and the United States were really keen on ancient history and archaeology, but they also had a lot of crazy ideas about it. Nothing much has changed in that regard, but you know, it's just to get you into the space. This is kind of the world we're in right now. And of course, then in the late 1800s, we're also dealing with a time period, like many other time periods, where there was a lot of anti-Semitism going on in Europe. Jews have, and in different points in time, in different places in the world, been subjects to anti-Semitism, to strong discrimination, to violence, pogroms, ethnic cleansings. This has been a theme for thousands of years, and well, suffice it to say that was also the case in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And well, Friedrich Delitzsch, he kind of ended up becoming one of the faces of this type of anti-Semitism before Adolf Hitler kind of became the face of anti-Semitism, I suppose. But yeah, suffice it to say, Delitzsch, he had these lecture series where he talked about parallels between the biblical and the Mesopotamian mythological sort of corpora. And he became at first quite popular. The first lecture he held, in fact, he was invited by the German Emperor Wilhelm II. This is before World War I. This is like 1904, 05. Wilhelm II invited him to come and redo his first lecture at one of his palaces, which he did, and this garnered him a lot of public attention. Now, what ended up happening, unfortunately, is that Delitzsch, he seemed to become more and more convinced that really what was going on here was that the Jews had deceived everyone by writing wrong things in the Hebrew Bible, which, and by the way, he had a lot of wild in his this lecture series consisted of 3 lectures, and in his last one, which also became a book, he's essentially saying, he goes full crazy. He says that the daughter of Sargon in Hedwana was actually like an Aryan, like a blonde Aryan princess, and he essentially pulls a bunch of crazy shit out of his ass and just expects people to believe it. And he does a lot to really sort of make his readers as suspicious of Jewish people as possible. And obviously this really didn't end well for Jewish people in general, and for this entire sort of discipline of science also. This led not only to distortion of research, of sort of the understanding of historical documents and literary documents, it also led to actual violence. It led to death, and Assyriologists having to, or Jewish people, both in the case of Beno Landsberger, who we'll get to in a second, having to escape the country, not to be killed. A lot of Assyriologists who were German, or non-Jewish at least, and were not accused of communism or anything like that at any point, were kind of forced, well, either they did it voluntarily or they were forced to keep doing their job, but kind of, creating quote-unquote science that was in alignment with the Nazi party's view of the world. This became more and more prominent as the Nazis grew in power. Remember that Hitler was in charge of Germany for a long time before World War II blew up or started. So this was something that was going on over a long period of time. And even though Delitzsch was not directly involved in the later period of this kind of activity going on, this was happening for a long time. And it was a terrible tragedy for almost everyone involved. So, in any case, enter Beno Landsberger. This was a very brief little overview for you of the Babel-Bibel controversy here. Obviously, the reason also, just to get that in there as well, the reason that Delitzsch called his lecture series the Babel-Bibel controversy was because he also had some frankly stupid ideas about these words sounding similar and how that might also be something. He was really just grasping at straws, trying to compare anything that could be compared and making out the crazy theories from those comparisons that he didn't really have any grounding in. This is always a danger when you're doing comparative work, but it's not always that it ends up in genocide. There's a lot of things to do wrong in science, but you really have to do many things wrong to get to the point that Delitzsch got to. Again, I recommend looking into this period of history, generally speaking, because I think we could learn a lot from it if we understood how public discourse worked in the 30s. I think we might be better off now trying to make decisions about the world. I'm not going to say anything else. Let's just move on to Beno Landsberger, our little hero in this narrative. Beno was a Jewish Assyriologist from Germany, and he held this very famous speech in 1925, which he published in 1926, which ended up essentially giving him the moniker the founding father of modern Assyriology. Now, why was this? Well, for several reasons. First of all, this lecture was given to grapple with the consequences of the Babel-Bibel controversy, which were already far-ranging in the mid-1920s. So Landsberger essentially says, we must study any culture. He calls it Babylonian civilization. I have some problems with the term civilization that we can get back to at some other point, not here. But suffice it to say, Landsberger, he argues that we can only study Babylonian civilization by understanding it on its own terms. That means we cannot compare it to sort of biblical cultures when we don't even really understand the Babylonian culture itself yet. We have barely deciphered the writing. We've barely understood how the languages even work. At this point in the mid-1920s, this is kind of happening, but we're not there yet at all. So the 1920s is when some of the earliest Assyriology departments in the world are being established. So this is really early in the history of Assyriology, relatively speaking. And Landsberger is essentially pointing out, well, we only just started really seriously studying it 50, 70 years ago. So we cannot already start trying to explain it via an entirely different culture or an entirely different language that we also don't know that much about. At this point, the Dead Sea Scrolls hadn't even been found, which meant that probably the oldest fragment of a Bible that anyone had access to at this point in time was the Vilnius Bible or something. It would have been from about year 1000, so quite a bit later than the first authoring of these books were supposed to have happened, at least according to sort of tradition. So Landsberger, as he says it, the material we have for Babylonian civilization sind nur Inseln in the Meere des Stoffes. They are only islands in the ocean of materials that, or in the oceans of materials. And if we look at them naively, we'll understand even less than we did before. That was kind of his main point. He argues also that Assyriologists should kind of step back from the public sphere and not really get involved in these sort of public discussions that end up in controversy and vilification of whole groups of people. Instead, Assyriologists should focus on doing our little narrow philological studies and really hone in on understanding the language, understanding the grammar, understanding, as he says, Babylonian civilization on its own terms before trying to compare it to a bunch of other things. He does by the way, he doesn't say we should never do this. He argues that a lot of scientific progress comes from the lively exchange between specialists and generalists, and this is very true, I think. But he is of the, and I think at the time, convincing frame of mind that way more work needs to go into Assyriology and understanding the Babylonians and the Assyrians, ancient Mesopotamians, before we can really start making grand comparisons and trying to make theories about how these things came to be to begin with. So that's the long and the short of the Babel-Bibel controversy. I really, like I said, recommend you look into this more deeply, because it's both interesting and sort of horrifying, but also highly relevant for today. Science, or people who claim to be scientists, are still very much intermingling ideology and science into one. This is happening in a lot of different ways, in a lot of different places, also with archaeology and history. Looking at you, Graham Hancock. And so I think this is, I think it's important to remember these things and to study these things and understand them. Unfortunately, one thing that happened, which was, in my opinion, a shame, was that Assyriologists all over the world, they really took Landsberger's advice to heart very strongly. This was both a good thing, because the understanding of the Akkadian and Sumerian languages and the cuneiform writing system have only exponentially grown over the past century. Unfortunately, it did not really because of Landsberger, more because of the controversy itself. The relationship between Assyriology and biblical scholarship really soured and kind of grew stale. Now, there have been individual attempts at doing research on these parallels later on. It's certainly happened, and it has been talked about and grappled with again later on by other prominent Assyriologists, such as Leo Oppenheim. And this is all well and good, but there has been no real sort of systematized field comparing the biblical and Mesopotamian sort of mythological corpora or intellectual traditions. This is not something that's really been looked into, amongst others, because people were kind of a little bit averse to it. They didn't really want to go into the controversy again or try to rip up old wounds or anything like that, which is understandable. But I think at the same time also an unfortunate sort of side consequence of this horrible controversy. So the question then is, what can we do about this? How do we start comparing, maybe in a more systematized manner, the biblical and Mesopotamian literary corpora without selling one short, without underestimating the conceptual autonomy, as Landsberger called it? Well, he was speaking in German, so he called it Eigenbegrifflichkeit, but conceptual autonomy, translated for you guys. I imagine many of you don't know German, so here you go. And it's a great word, though, Eigenbegrifflichkeit. I know it doesn't really, if you're English native, it doesn't really translate the same way. It means like own conceptuality or something like that would be the direct translation. Anyways, what do we do? How can we both keep in mind the Eigenbegrifflichkeit of a civilization or a culture or a religion for that matter, while we also compare it to another religion or culture? And there are many ways this could be done, but I suggest in my thesis that one thing we can do is try to look a little bit at theory and a little bit at narrative, how we frame history of the world, how we frame the history of Europe. Is there anything that can be done there? Now, as it so happens, things are already being done and have been done for a while. And one example that I thought was great, and I thought was something we could use for inspiration, is the example of Gareth Fowden and his lovely monography from 2014, Before and After Muhammad, the First Millennium Refocused. In this, I think, pretty convincing work, he makes an argument for why we should include Islam and the sort of the Middle East into the history of Europe. Also in terms of the history of ideas, because, well, not everyone knows this, but I think it's becoming more common knowledge these days. What is often referred to as the Renaissance in European history, this sort of return to the classical thinkers and Greek philosophy and all these things, none of that would have been possible without what's called the translation movement and the House of Wisdom in Baghdad in Iraq, in which from the sort of 700s until year 1000, more or less, a lot of translation was happening of ancient Greek texts and Latin texts, Aramaic, and so on and so forth, Jewish texts as well. But specifically, and often especially, Greek texts were translated into Aramaic, into Arabic. There's a lot of Arabic theology, or Islamic theology, from sort of the 700s, 800s that relies heavily on Greek philosophy. Really, a lot of Islamic theology in general relies heavily on Greek philosophy. This is something that a lot of people know, but it's becoming more common knowledge steadily. And of course, this also has strong implications for the development of the sort of concept of the Renaissance. This couldn't really have happened without all of these sort of intellectual developments taking place in the Middle East, in Damascus, in Baghdad, in Alexandria before that. This is also where a lot of these sources came from. So, there's a lot of interesting things going on here. And Fowden essentially says, well, even the development of Islam as a religion quite closely mirrors the development of Judaism and Christianity as religions. There's a lot of points of commonality there, and one thing that is really common for both Judaism, Christianity, and Islam is that these three are religions of scripture and exegesis. Excuse me, I don't know what happened there. Anyways, exegesis. Exegetic religion is something else that you could call Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. They rely to quite a large degree on the interpretation of scripture. And this is something that happened. This is not something that was always the case. This is something that happened throughout the first millennium. Fowden calls it the maturation of religions. He has this 3-stage process by which a religion becomes mature. Now, you can say a lot of things about this. Does that mean that religions that don't have exegesis are not mature? But we're just talking about Judaism, Christianity, and Islam here. That's kind of his framework. He's not trying to say that religions that aren't exactly like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are like less good. He's just trying to include Islam in the history of Judaism and Christianity, if that makes sense. So this is a quite flexible process, the maturation process, like the prophetic, scriptural, and exegetic stages. These can be going on sort of with overlap as well. It's not like it has to happen in this very strict way. It can happen in different ways, and the stages can overlap, and so on and so forth. The long and the short of it is that Islam, in Fowden's argument, and I think again that it's a convincing argument, Islam's development does not represent the radical break from late antiquity into the Middle Ages that it's often been in earlier scholarship on Islam. Islam was basically seen as sort of the heavy, stagnant, medieval sort of dark cloud that essentially made the Middle Ages the Dark Ages. That was kind of because of the developments that started happening with Islam. Newer scholarship, including Fowden, would say, actually, that's not really true. That's a strange sort of Renaissance bias against religion that used to exist in a lot of European scholarship. But it's kind of decreased. And in any case, Fowden argues that you can actually not see this as a radical break in any ways. The development of the religion of Islam was quite sort of, it relied on a lot of the same things that development of Christianity and Judaism relied on, like Greek philosophy and the exchange between different thinkers, philosophers, and theologians debating different ideas that had been really around and debated at least since Plato and Aristotle, and probably longer if you ask me, and other people. Even when you go down to stuff like state building, a lot of the early caliphs, they relied a lot on strategies that were also used in the Roman and Persian empires to build states, to create administrative practices that could sort of keep together the kingdoms or empires, collect taxes, so on and so forth. And Fowden's real sort of main point here that he wanted to drive home was that the thing that more than anything else describes the period of late antiquity, which is, of course, late antiquity is a scholarly periodization. It's modern historians have made this period because they think there's something going on in that period around the Mediterranean that is sort of significant enough to describe it as its own time period. But late antiquity has been a time period that's been critiqued quite a lot for being pretty vague. Fowden, he argues that one can actually make it less vague by saying that the primary sort of axis around which late antiquity turns is this maturation of religion, is this move of religions to become more exegetic in nature, sort of in this intermix with Greek philosophy and translation of texts and intellectual exchanges. These are sort of the modus operandi of late antiquity as a scholarly periodization. Okay, great. So, how do we do this then? Well, the reason I chose Fowden and the reason I found him interesting was I read his work and I thought, well, what if we do something like what he wanted to do with Islam, but we do it for before what is usually called Abrahamic religion became a thing? What if we do it, at, so to speak, at the front end of late antiquity? Could you consider late Babylonian and Assyrian religious practices, as well as their sort of literature, literary traditions, intellectual traditions? Could you argue that late Mesopotamia is pretty late antique in some sense? I think you can. Now, of course, this was a master's thesis. I wasn't trying to reinvent the wheel or anything here. So I just give some pointers. I didn't have space to do much else than present the argument that I have now presented to you. This took about 100 pages. And then I had a little bit of space left to just, give some pointers, some suggestions for things that could have been the case. In the example of Sargon and Moses, for example, well, again, the earliest fragments we have of biblical books are from Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Those seem still, even with this sort of pushback on some of their dates, the Qumran texts seem to be from the 1st to 3rd centuries BCE overall. They, generally speaking, depending on what text you look at, what biblical book you find, you can see that a lot of them are still quite fluid, meaning a lot of them are not in the shape or form that we would find them in the Masoretic text, the sort of the Bible as we know it now, to say it in a different way. So that suggests that these texts were still in development at this point in time. They were still being sort of expanded, revised, used by different people in different ways, most likely. But that's all we can really say about it. In any case, I think we can presume that some of these books probably existed in some form also before the Qumran texts, even though then probably in an even less recognizable form than we would recognize them in today. But one could imagine something like, to get back to the Sargon story, several Assyriologists at this point, and this is quite interesting actually. When you look at Brian Lewis, when he made his PhD in the 1980s, if you can call it a consensus, the very precarious consensus at the time was that this was a story about the King Sargon of Akkad from the 2300s, king of Ur, and sort of southern Babylonia, or all of Babylonia maybe. But recently, Lewis himself, he was pretty sure that this was most likely a Neo-Assyrian text, meaning it was more likely to be from, say, the reign of Sargon II, and more meant to be a story sort of connecting Sargon II to the heritage of the Sargon figure. Sargon of Akkad in ancient Mesopotamia, he was kind of like the Alexander the Great of the ancient Near East. Everyone knew about him. Everyone knew his story. And he was someone who a lot of kings in ancient Mesopotamia and beyond looked up to, used as a sort of frame of reference for their own kingship, or they would say that they were actually related to him, like, to make their own reigns seem more legitimate. They would say that, oh yeah, I'm actually the descendant of Sargon, and so on. So he was a big name, and he was, for several thousand years, people knew and referred to this great King Sargon, and all the cool things he did. So there's a lot of suspicion at this point that the Sargon legend may have actually been created at some point after the ascension of Sargon II to the Assyrian imperial throne, and that it was part of this sort of Neo-Assyrian Sargonid state ideology, essentially, that was being constructed around these sort of this century from the 700s to the late 600s BCE, when, of course, Assyria is defeated by the Babylonian-Median alliance, which eventually, of course, leads to the Babylonian exile. So there's a lot. But in short, the Assyrians were also making conquests everywhere, in essentially every direction around this time, also into Judea and Israel. And well, I could imagine myself, it's known that Assyrian kings would make these vassal treaties. For example, actually, the book of Deuteronomy has a lot of similarities with the vassal treaties of King Sennacherib, which is in itself quite interesting. And I don't know, we know that the Assyrians would take these treaties and they would translate them to the languages of whichever vassal that they were making the treaty with. And after the treaty was signed as well, for that matter, the representatives of the Assyrian state would be sent to the different vassals, to temples or other places where people would come and meet. And these texts would be read aloud, sometimes bilingually, sometimes in translation. And I don't know, if I could imagine myself being like, like a Jewish intellectual, maybe even a priest or something like that, hearing this sort of Assyrian vassal treaty and how, oh yeah, we're supposed to bow down to the great Assyrian emperor, blah, blah, blah. Hearing all that and being like, you know what, fuck you, man. And we have our own cool guy who's our ancient king from back in the day, who has his own cool birth story. We don't need your kingship around here. I don't want to pay tax to you. Get out of here. That's just one sentiment, at least, that I could imagine being present in a situation like that. And I could imagine characters like Moses, who obviously I'm not saying Moses was invented to challenge Sargon, but a character like Moses who probably already existed in Jewish tradition at this point in time. He could have very well just had a little bit of a sort of, someone went like, oh, well, he actually also has a cool birth story. We don't need yours. No, Moses is just a cooler version of you, basically. It's a challenge to the Assyrian hegemony. That's how I like to see that, or at least I like to see that as one out of undoubtedly many explanations for why these two stories are so similar. Okay, that was just Sargon and Moses. I'm gonna talk a little bit more about Gilgamesh and Genesis here, because as I said, these are more well understood, and the texts themselves are more well understood, because the Sargon legend, like I said, we have four fragmented versions of it, so there's not a lot of stuff to work with there. But in terms of the Gilgamesh Genesis context, well, this is quite interesting. If you will think back to the religious maturation argument presented before, the idea was essentially that over a period of time, according to Garth Fowden, it would be over the first millennium, but I think we can go further back in time. Over a period of time, several religious traditions developed a focus on writing and revelation extractable from said writing by trained professionals who knew how to work with the text. This idea became quite central in the religions of the first millennium, like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, as they matured. My argument is that you can see a lot of that tendency already going on in Gilgamesh and in the editorial history of Gilgamesh. So let's talk about Gilgamesh for a little bit. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which I don't really like that term, mostly because epic is something, we use that for Greek legends and literature, and it kind of implies a genre that I'm not always convinced we can use about Gilgamesh. And also, it was never called the Epic of Gilgamesh by any of the ancient Akkadians or Akkadian speakers who would have known the story. It was known as, often it was called Ishkar Gilgamesh, which means the Gilgamesh series. And I like to call it that, actually, because that's a cool descriptive name for it, the Gilgamesh series. That's what it is. So that's what I usually call it. But you may have been wondering, why does he call it the Standard Babylonian version of Gilgamesh? That's a very long title. That's because the editorial history of Gilgamesh spans a couple thousand years. The first stories we have of Gilgamesh, first of all, Gilgamesh may have been a historical person. We don't know at all, but he may have lived and been a ruler at some point in like the 2500s BCE or something, a long time ago. We don't know this. It's just there are a few things that could point to that being the case. Read my thesis if you want all the examples. But suffice it to say that in the earliest stories about Gilgamesh, the epilogue and prologue, as they're called, the sort of the introduction and the ending to the story, they stress that Gilgamesh is a very cool, heroic guy who's very strong, and he has a lot of initiative power, and he just gets stuff done. He's a go-get-em type of guy. He has a great attitude for getting work done. Cool, strong king man type of figure, But then you move on to the later versions of Gilgamesh, for example, the standard version. To put it into context, the oldest stories of Gilgamesh we have are in Sumerian, from like the late 3rd millennium BCE. Then we start getting more sort of standardized versions in Akkadian around what's called the Old Babylonian period. That's like 1900 to 1700 BCE-ish, plus minus. Maybe even as far as the 1600s BCE. You can discuss that. In any case, this is kind of these Akkadian language Gilgamesh stories are still in the same vein. It's about the heroicism of Gilgamesh and how cool he is. But then in the standard versions, which are from like 1200 to 700 BCE, kind of plus minus ish, it's not that easy to tell. In the standard version, there's a new prologue and a new epilogue. They have been added as well. So the old epilogue and prologue is still there from the ancient, at this point in time, versions of the Gilgamesh story, but more prologue and epilogue has been added to give the whole narrative a new context. And very interestingly, in the standard version, what Gilgamesh is praised for, what the introduction of the story and the ending of the story tells the reader is the main thing we should remember Gilgamesh for, as his primary accomplishment, is that Gilgamesh was able to bring back knowledge about creation from before the flood. A big part of the Gilgamesh narrative, which becomes especially important in this version when framed like this, is the 10th tablet, the exchange Gilgamesh has with Utnapishtim, where he goes to find Utnapishtim and his wife. One thing I didn't mention earlier is that after the story of Utnapishtim and the Great Flood that I told you about a while ago, Utnapishtim and his wife, they were granted eternal life and kind of moved to this island that exists beyond time and space, kind of. In the standard version of Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh goes here and finds Utnapishtim, and he has him... Well, he wants Utnapishtim to tell him how to gain eternal life. This is part of the whole Gilgamesh narrative. While I don't have time to explain the whole Gilgamesh narrative here, suffice it to say that that doesn't happen. Gilgamesh actually finds this plant which does supposedly give him eternal life, but he ends up losing it and is very sad about it. But he then returns home and he kind of has this new sort of stoic, seemingly, attitude. He's a bit more happy about things and is then praised because what he did, bringing back this crazy knowledge from outside of time and space, this was his greatest accomplishment, and an accomplishment that would stand longer than any city wall or grand temple or palace, This is interesting because this shows a shift in the tradition surrounding Gilgamesh and how the people working with the text wanted it to be understood. And, I wouldn't be the first to suggest that around the time of the standard Epic of Gilgamesh, scribes seem to be growing increasingly important. Now, it should be said that scribes is a wide phenomenon in Mesopotamia. There are many kinds of people who are experts in different texts and working with different texts, different kinds of medical practitioners and priests and exorcists and so on and so forth are all educated in cuneiform and know how to work with cuneiform. And cuneiform is a quite complex writing system. So it seems like politically at this time there's a class of scribes that has become quite important, quite prestigious, and politically influential, also within the royal court. And, it's not too surprising then that religious literature, let's call it that, starts reflecting this change in importance. This is something we see in Judaism as well as we move to rabbinic Judaism, and ideology starts to develop surrounding how revelation is both given and interpreted. So in rabbinic Judaism, as you may also know from having read my Substack before, in rabbinic Judaism there is this idea that Moses received the full revelation, both written and oral, on Mount Sinai, and that the job of the rabbis is to essentially perpetually translate this revelation, extract the revelation from the scriptures, because all of it is there, but not all of it is readily available. Some will have to be debated and discussed in order to be understood. Some will change over time, because that's also part of revelation. Revelation works and changes over time with people, in a way, but it was always there. So that's kind of how the ideology developed within rabbinic Judaism. And we also know that this, to some degree, was a reflection of the social and political circumstances of the rabbis themselves that sort of gave rise to this change. So, I have a suspicion that this kind of way of framing different characters as kind of prophetic, different texts as having this kind of apocalyptic or prophetic revelatory nature, this is something that I don't think that we can say that Western European, I guess at this point just West Asian history of ideas began with Aristotle and Genesis, because there are too many things going on that are similar before that, if that makes sense. Right. So, I hope in the future to be able to work much more with these parallels, to be able to work much more with the interconnectedness and intertextuality of Mesopotamian, Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, Roman scripture, intellectual traditions, because I do think there's something there, and I think that it might, instead of making one group of people sort of seem like they're the bad guys, my goal is more to draw attention to the point that actually we're all kind of similar and we all kind of work surprisingly in very similar ways, even across many millennia. People, we do be humaning. And, I don't know what else do I have any more? What else do I want to say here? I guess I can just give you a few little tidbits to finish off today. And you are welcome, of course, to send me a message. Ask me any questions you have. Look at the thesis. If you're interested, if you didn't look at the thesis and you've now heard me say some things where you're like, oh, that sounds interesting, go look at the thesis. It's readily available. And you can also find, of course, all the literature I used in the literature lists there. Right, but there are many venues to still look into. Aramaic language, I'm currently learning classical Syriac, which I think will be part of this whole equation. But Aramaic language in general certainly is something that we should look into more, because I don't think it's been studied not enough in the context of mediation between Hebrew and Akkadian. And I really think there's something going on there. Many other different interesting sort of cases to look into when it comes to exchange and parallels between the biblical and Mesopotamian literary traditions. For example, the ideas of humans being made of clay. This is something we find in medical tablets from Babylonia, and something I really want to go into more because it's super interesting. Also, the practice that these medical practitioners have with their texts, and how they get medical diagnoses from the interpretation of the text. Again, I think there's something kind of akin to the rabbinical tradition and practices going on there. Gilgamesh shows up in the Book of Giants from the Qumran texts. That's kind of weird. Suddenly you have a Book of Giants where Gilgamesh is a giant in this text. I believe Humbaba, the monster from the cedar forests, is actually there too. Why is that? We have no idea, but it's pretty interesting, isn't it? There are some things about Nabu, the son of Marduk, in later Assyrian and Babylonian religion that is also pretty interesting. He has some very, very interesting parallels to sort of how prophethood becomes conceptualized in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. In fact, Nabu's name, Nabu, is cognate with the words for prophet in both Arabic and Hebrew and Aramaic. So, I don't know. There's just so many weird things going on in here. I could talk about it for a long time. Here's a little bibliography. But yeah, you already know where we're at. But that was it. That was all I had to tell you for today. I hope you found that interesting, at least somewhat. Like I said at the beginning, this is probably going to be a pretty atypical format with regards to podcasts. I don't know if I'm going to keep doing these type of uploads here on Substack, where I will do both video and audio content. I think I will rely on Substack mainly on audio content. I might start doing YouTube videos. In that case, you will of course be notified in here on Substack if that's the case. All right, that's it. So, if you've made it all the way to the end, wow, well done. Thanks a lot for taking your time to listen to any of this. This is pretty long in form. I might, at least if you're interested, I might do shorter sort of podcasts where I go into, maybe more sort of chill or basic things about ancient history. Stuff like what's cuneiform? What kind of script is that? How does it work? What kind of languages are Akkadian and Sumerian, or Hebrew and Arabic, and how do their alphabets work, and these kinds of things. I don't know, that might be fun to do. Let me know if you want stuff like that, sort of more relaxed, where I also just, tangent about random stuff, whatever. Let me know. And again, thanks for today. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.